Hi there. My name is Dr. Rachele Pojednic. A lot of people have been talking about the dietary guidelines for Americans, and everybody has an opinion and a hot take. But do you even know what the dietary guidelines are and what they're for? I've been a professor of nutrition for well over a decade, and I just thought it was time to set the record straight on what actually are the dietary guidelines? Where do they come from? How do we create them? So, here's a little primer for you in case you're interested. All right, so the first thing to know about the dietary guidelines is that they're actually not for you. Well, unless you're a policymaker. The dietary guidelines are actually just a policy document. There's one little part for you, which is an infographic that's pretty infamous, and we'll talk about it. But really, what the dietary guidelines do is form the basis of federal nutrition policy. They also help with different educational efforts and outreach and food assistance program guidelines like SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, used to be known as food stamps, WIC, the Women, Infant, and Children Program, or school breakfasts and school lunches. And because of this, it also helps to guide local, state, and national health promotion and disease prevention initiatives. So it really sort of just creates boundaries and guidelines for where we want to be creating talk tracks. It also helps to inform various organizations and industries to help create and develop products within the guidelines themselves. And it helps to start set some guidelines for marketing and what people can and can't say in the food and beverage industry. And it's also really important to note that they're revised every 5 years. I've been seeing some headlines out there that says nutrition guidelines haven't been touched in 5 years. That's the plan. They're supposed to be updated only every 5 years. And you'll see why in just a second. It really has to do with how long it takes to update the data. All right, so up until very recently, the 2025 guidelines, you would have found the dietary guidelines at dietaryguidelines.gov. And so I just took a screenshot of the last edition of the dietary guidelines because this is actually not where you're going to find the new guidelines. This is kind of now just an archive of where the previous iterations had been. And so, who actually oversees the guidelines? Interestingly, it's kind of a collaboration between government, between scientists, and even industry and the general population. So, first, you should know that who writes the guidelines inside of the government is going to be the Secretary of Agriculture, which is currently Brooke Rollins, and the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Now, this year, the 2025 guidelines followed a very different protocol than previously. And one of the real issues and sticking points with the new dietary guidelines was the scientific committee. So, there are essentially four areas, as I mentioned, where the input is going to come in to create the guidelines, which is actually a document that is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages long, usually accompanied by a supplemental, which includes all of the research up until that point. And then finally, an executive summary, which up until recently has been somewhere in the range of about 40 to 60 pages or so. And this year's is only 9. So this is where the controversy starts to come in, is the typical flow with which the guidelines are advised was kind of disrupted. So 2 years ago, the Scientific Advisory Committee was appointed. And so you can see this is a group of scientists that they bring in from around the world that are experts in their fields. So it might be that somebody is an expert in pediatric nutrition or geriatric nutrition or agriculture. And so they bring these folks in and they create this very large group of experts and they task them with a 2-year project. Essentially, where is the research now compared to where it was 5 years ago? And so, what this scientific committee does is they break it down into chunks. The first is they try to look at whether or not eating patterns have changed kind of writ large in the population in the United States. And so they analyze how the types of foods and beverages that are being consumed have changed over the last 5 years. So, really, this is just about consumption patterns. And then they do a gigantic data analysis of where all of the data from the previous iteration, so 5 years ago, has evolved. So they go and look at the research in and of itself. And what they do is they answer a whole collection of predetermined questions so that they can have some guidelines as to what they should be looking at and what they shouldn't, and then the questions that they should be answering and updating. And so through this process, you get a real 360-degree view picture of what has changed from a consumption perspective and what the research actually says. And so that's great, but that's just one part of what goes into the dietary guidelines. That's going to result in, again, a scientific advisory report that's hundreds of pages long. Each of these people have a team of, 10, 15, 20 people that are going to help them, usually postdocs or doctoral students or other collaborators and colleagues that are experts in the field themselves. And so they work on that for 2 full years to create this document. Then other people get involved. So when we look at the last couple of iterations, thanks to the internet and the modern way that we can communicate with each other, you as a consumer can actually get involved. So this is becoming kind of the ultimate intersection of scientists, politics, which we'll talk about in just a second, and you as the public. So now when you have the dietary guidelines and it was open over the past 2 years, the public gets to weigh in and say, this is how I feel about nutrition, this is how I feel about agriculture, and all of that is aggregated and given to the secretary so that they can put that picture into the dietary guidelines. So you want to look for that in the coming years. But I will say again, I don't really know how much of this was used because, as you'll see in just a second, the process was really changed this year for the 2025 guidelines that were just released. And then finally, this is another group that gets to weigh in. It's the lobbyists. It is a political document. It is done by the government. And so there's influence by lobbyists, as there is for everything in the government. And so the food industry and the special interest groups like the Cattlemen's Association, different agricultural groups, Big Sugar, they get to weigh in as well. And this is a little bit more behind closed doors. So lobbyists work in the offices essentially of the politicians. And this is a really good example. This was from a couple of iterations ago. And what they found was that the scientists were trying to make recommendations for stricter sugar and alcohol guidelines. And as it turned out, big alcohol and big sugar kind of got their claws into the whole process. And those guidelines never became part of the released, 60 or 80 executive report that came out in 2020. Another example was the iteration before. There were guidelines from the scientific committee looking at the environmental impact of agriculture on health of people, health of the environment. And that never actually ended up being in the guidelines either. Because at the end of the day, the Health and Human Services Secretary, again, now is RFK Jr., and the Secretary of the USDA, Brooke Rollins, get to decide what goes in and what doesn't go in the guidelines. And so I think it's really important for people to know that this has always been a politically driven document. This year, it's getting a ton of press, and for good reason, and we'll talk about why in just a minute. But we shouldn't ever be thinking, oh, this was strictly informed by the scientists up until this point. Absolutely not. This was informed by many, many, many stakeholders. And at the end of the day, the Secretary of HHS, regardless of who it is in the current administration or previous administrations, and the Secretary of the USDA get to decide what goes in and what doesn't go into the report. So I just want to give you kind of a quick synopsis of where we've been with the dietary guidelines and how we've kind of gotten to where we have. So remember that the guidelines have been iterated every 5 years. The first report that ever came out was in 1980. And so I think you'll see that this is actually pretty familiar looking. So this is now 45 years ago. And what the recommendations were in general were to eat a variety of foods, maintain an ideal weight, avoid too much fat, particularly saturated fat and cholesterol, eat foods with adequate starch and fiber, avoid too much sugar, avoid too much sodium, and if you drink alcohol, do so in moderation. This was 45 years ago. The guidelines were kind of similar to what they are now. And so then we get some iterations here, and I just pulled a couple of screenshots from the guidelines back in the day. We start to see slight variations in vocabulary here, and this is where you can start to see where the stakeholders get hold of whatever politicians are in office at that point. So in this case, we are eating a variety of foods, we're maintaining a desirable weight, we're avoiding, this is an important word, too much fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. We want to eat foods with adequate starch and fiber. We want to avoid too much sugar, avoid too much sodium, and if you drink alcohol, do so in moderation. So one thing to just highlight here in this second iteration is we kind of have directional verbs, if you will. So avoid or eat. It's telling people what to stop doing and what to do. And again, what you can see here in the fine print is really similar to what we see in the current iteration. So if we're avoiding too much fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol, you can go through these bullet points here, but we're choosing lean meat. This is a slight variation from what we'll see in the current guidelines, and we want to eat more starch and fiber. And so these essentially are going to be your fruits and vegetables, and we are avoiding processed foods that contain a lot of fats and sugars. So 1990 rolls along, and now we are eating a variety of foods. We're maintaining a healthy weight. We are choosing a diet low in fat and saturated fat and cholesterol. So see how the language changed there a little bit. We are choosing a diet with plenty of vegetables, fruits, and grain products. Again, we're seeing some change in vocabulary here. We are using sugars only in moderation, and we are using salt and sodium only in moderation. If we're drinking alcohol, we're doing so moderately. Now, this is where people start to criticize the guidelines, is that if this is the infographic that you are going to see, it doesn't really now tell you which direction to go. It's saying choose a diet. And that really leaves it up to the consumer to figure out what that actually means. There's also funny words in here like moderate. Like, what does that actually mean to the consumer? Because most people don't know what a lot is or a little. And so moderate starts to get a little bit murky. That being said, if you dig into the hundreds of pages of the report, again, what you're going to see is pretty similar to what we have in the current 2025 guidelines. So, what do we mean by sugar? Well, in 1990, we were calling out that you should really be careful of these foods that you might see in an ingredient label. So, table sugar, brown sugar, all of these other places where you're going to find glucose, fructose, maltose, honey, syrups, high fructose corn syrup. Yes, we were calling out high fructose corn syrup back in 1990. But because there was no really good way to communicate to the populace, a lot of this just kind of got buried on the shelves in government. Remember, in 1990, we didn't have the internet. And so there was no really good way to give this hundreds and hundreds of pages to the population. And even if we did, they wouldn't really know what to do with it. So 1995 rolls around, and oh lordy, here is where the controversy begins. You'll see on the left that the infographic of the sort of words starts to change a little bit. This was partly due to the rings here. You might remember that the Olympics were in Atlanta in 1996, and so they were giving a little bit of a nod to that. And what you can now see is that we are balancing food that you eat with physical activity. So this is the first part that time that this has come up. Remember, it was maintain a healthy weight before. And now we're really talking about kind of a calories in, calories out component. We are choosing a diet low in fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. We're choosing a diet with plenty, again, really arbitrary word, of grain products, vegetables, and fruits. We're eating a variety of foods. We're choosing a diet moderate in salt and sodium, choosing a diet moderate in sugars. Again, what does this mean? And if you drink alcoholic beverages, do so in moderation. And so what you can see here is a softening of the language, which means that likely the stakeholders that were the lobbyists were starting to get the ears of the politicians. So we are choosing a diet moderate in sugars. Now, you have to sort of like know and look at the language a little bit, but choose is kind of a permission word, right? And so this is where things again start to get criticized is, even though the words in the actual report did not recommend choosing sugar, the infographic that starts to be released to the public is making it very murky for the average consumer to make a choice. And so this is again where the infamous pyramid makes its first debut. And so in this case, you can see that the grains are down the bottom. We've got fruits and vegetables that layer on top of it. Your proteins and your fat and your dairy groups are layered on top of that. And probably with good reason, this pyramid has gotten a lot of heat over the years, especially when you just look at the pictures that are on the pyramid itself. It's, refined grains, it's crackers, it's cereal, it's pasta. And, I think that there's a good reason why people think that this particular pyramid was problematic, especially where we want all of those grains to be whole. Here's the thing. If you actually go look at the dietary guidelines, nobody in the actual report ever said you should be eating bread and crackers and pasta. It actually said in the report that you should make the majority of your grains whole. And that just gets lost in this, I would argue, sort of terrible infographic. 2000 rolls around, we're still using that previous pyramid. And this is where things start to get a little interesting. So when you look at the graphic here on the left, what you see is again this nod to fitness, calories in, calories out, aim for a healthy weight, be physically active each day. And the other thing it starts to do, you might notice, is it gives you a red and a yellow color scheme here. So this is kind of like a stoplight scheme. Green means go, yellow means slow down, red means stop. And so in this case, they say build a healthy base. Let the pyramid guide your food choices. Again, I think this is where people start to get a little itchy about the pyramid. Choose a variety of grains daily, especially whole grains. Choose a variety of fruits and vegetables daily and keep food safe to eat. So this is another really interesting place where food choices the food choices changed or shifted a little bit is that we started talking about food safety, making sure that you put things in the refrigerator, don't eat old food, and then choose sensibly, choose a diet that is low in saturated fat and cholesterol and moderate in total fat. Choose beverages and foods to moderate your intake of sugar. So this is where we start to give a nod to sugar sweetened beverages. And choose and prepare foods with less salt. And if you drink alcohol, drink in moderation. And so, again, I just screenshotted this from the actual report of the dietary guidelines on the right. It really lays out, where does saturated fat come from? Where does cholesterol come from? At the time, we had trans fatty acids. They have since been taken out of the food system in the United States. What are unsaturated fat? And on the right, what you can see, again, this is 25 years ago, how to increase your intake of whole grain foods. Brown rice, bulgur, cracked wheat, gram flour, oatmeal, popcorn, whole barley, whole cornmeal, whole oats, whole rye, whole wheat. We have been beating the whole grain drum. And yet, because it looked like pasta and crackers on the infographic, this is where the messaging really starts to break down. And this is why it's so important that public health messaging mirrors what the science is actually showing and mirrors these documents. And this is so important for the iteration that we're coming to in 2025. Now, the really interesting thing is that between the pyramid that was just released the other day and the infamous pyramid that is everybody's straw man, there were actually two more infographics that came up. In 2005, they completely revised the My Pyramid. So we actually only used that pyramid with the crackers on the bottom for about 10 years. This one came out, and everybody agreed almost immediately that it was an absolute hot mess because people had no idea how to actually read it. The vertical or semi vertical lines were really confusing to people because they didn't really understand what each color meant. And in the full version of the infographic, what you can sort of see is it looks like a toddler took a bunch of food and threw it on the ground. And that was supposed to be representative of the amount of choices that you were supposed to make for each of these foods. Now, I would argue, and this is just my personal opinion, that this pyramid looks an awful lot like the inverted one that we got a few days ago, where it's just kind of like a mess of foods that you should be choosing from. The other thing that I'd like to call out here is nobody, and in none of the guidelines, even you could argue the pyramid before, was advocating for processed foods. And so the 2025 guidelines, the headline on the top is Eat Real Food. And I would argue if you look at these infographics as well as the graphics that went along with the words from the dietary guideline report, there was never a mention of increasing ultra processed food. That was driven so much more by the market and by consumerism, not by the public policy document here. And so, again, what you can see is we're consuming a variety of foods within the basic food groups. We're controlling calorie intake to manage weight. Please be physically active every day. Increase the daily intakes of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, reduced fat milk, and milk products. Again, this is where you see the first iteration of the reduced fat. But we do see increased daily intake. So now we've got some directionality. We're choosing fats wisely for good health, which what does that mean? I have no idea. We're choosing carbohydrates wisely for good health. Again, this is really important because it seems like it's a little redundant that we would choose carbohydrates wisely when 2 bullet points ahead, they were saying choose fruits and vegetables, whole grains. Those are all carbohydrate sources. We're choosing and repairing foods with little salt. If you drink alcohol, do so in moderation, and please keep your foods safe. 2010 rolls around, and this is where the next infographic that was supposed to be consumer facing emerges. This is the My Plate. So, this is the infographic that we've been using for now going on 15 years. And the choosemyplate.gov was the next iteration. So no pyramids anymore, either the messy toddler pyramid or the original pyramid that everybody loses their mind over. And what you can see is pretty simple. It's pretty directional. You can look at the plate and figure out what you're supposed to do. Fruits and vegetables fill half your plate. Grains, they should be whole as a quarter. Protein, whatever you choose, should be on the bottom right. And then you can see that this is an interesting place where the dairy lobby gets put in. So you've got a cup of milk, presumably off to the right. And so what we're doing is we're balancing our calories, again, enjoying food, but only eating to satisfaction, avoiding oversized portions. We're making half your plate fruits and vegetables. We're switching to low fat or fat-free milk. And the reason for that had nothing to do with the actual composition of milk and everything to do with the uptick in obesity rates and wanting to just be proactive about reducing total calorie intake for people. I think that we can probably safely say that there has been enough data to show that eating a satiating whole food or whole fat dairy is probably helpful for satiety, but what we don't know is if it actually increases total calorie intake. We'll figure that out over the next several years. And then compare sodium in foods like soup, bread, and frozen meals. So really telling you to look at the label, choose the food with the lower number. So again, we've got directionality here. And then this one was really interesting. Drink water instead of sugary drinks. So this was really throwing a stake in the ground saying, stop drinking your sugary drinks, and here's the substitute that we want. The 2015 guidelines got a little wordy. So I'm not going to go into great detail, but basically what they were saying is follow a healthy eating pattern across the lifespan. So start young and continue on. Focus on a variety of nutrient-dense foods and the amount that you're eating. Limit calories from added sugar, saturated fat, and sodium. Shift to healthier food and beverage choices, and support healthy eating patterns for all. So this is really where we start to see an equity lens, because what we recognized in the earlier iterations is that it was a very meat and potatoes kind of plate guidelines, which appealed to a segment of the American population, but not to everyone. And so, for example, a stew or a casserole or a curry or something like that didn't look like my plate, even though it was probably really good for you. And so they were starting to give a nod to that in these guidelines. And then finally, we had the 2020 to 2025 guidelines. These were really interesting because they started even younger. Up until this point, the dietary guidelines were for children aged 2 and above. And this one was really unique because they created guidelines for age 0, so birth to 2 years old, which included guidelines for breastfeeding. You still see those almost identically in the current iteration. Now, one thing I want to call out to you is what we call the Healthy Eating Index in the United States. The Healthy Eating Index is actually a measurement, it's a survey tool or a checklist tool that shows how close the American population is actually getting to the dietary guidelines. So I think you can see so far that the dietary guidelines have not changed that much, maybe subtly here and there, but that the general messaging was kind of the same. However, what we can see with the Healthy Eating Index is how well have people actually been following those instructions since 1980. And as it turns out, not well. If you were to grade the American population on a scale of 0 to 100, we would be getting Fs here in every single category, in every single age group. Young kids do a little bit better, older adults do a little bit better, but still not great. And if you look at our adolescents, they are really not doing well. They're not following these guidelines. They're actually eating the ultra processed foods that everybody is talking about. But that's not because the dietary guidelines told them to. It's because market forces nudged them toward those choices. And so, if we look at this infamous pyramid that I truly believe is being used as a straw man, what we see is it has not actually been used, particularly the one that is so egregious, since 1995. There was a pyramid in between that was also kind of a hot mess, arguably looks a little bit like the pyramid we got today. And the longest iteration of the infographic was actually just a plate of food that said exactly what the current administration is saying: eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, have a little bit of grains, and have your protein of choice, and go ahead and have some dairy. So when we look at this screenshot or these screenshots from the current administration, what we see on the left is the inverted pyramid that is so infamous. And then we see the pyramid that we haven't used since 1995 as the comparator. So this was a screenshot directly from the Eat Real Food, or sorry, realfood.gov website that says, for decades, we've been misled by guidance that prioritized highly processed food and are now facing rates of unprecedented chronic disease. This is actually not true at all. Nobody prioritized highly processed food. And also, this pyramid hasn't been used for decades. Flip to the new guidelines, and what we see is kind of an inverted pyramid where the grains are now at the bottom and the high fat dairy and meats are at the top, along with fruits and vegetables. And if you look at the changes that are in the now 9-page executive summary of the dietary guidelines. Remember, it used to be 50 or 60 pages because it was supposed to be a policy document to guide federal, state, and local level nutrition interventions. What we see is that really this current administration has made it a consumer-facing document. And so the changes that are really major that we're seeing are consuming a variety of protein foods that start with animal sources, including eggs, poultry, seafood, and red meat. And then they kind of throw away what the previous iterations were leaning towards, which were legumes, peas, beans, nuts, seeds, and soy. And they also changed the protein serving size and serving goals to 1.6 to 1.2 to 1.6 grams per protein per kilogram of body weight per day. Now, this is really interesting because the National Academy of Sciences and Medicine was previously the group that changed these recommendations according to the DRIs and the RDAs. And I can't quite find the answer here as to whether the HHS can actually supersede those recommendations. They are in the document, and it's eventually the FDA and within the HHS has to make these recommendations to change them. But the dietary guidelines has never been a place where those changes have been recommended or made a guideline. And this is important because there's actually a lot of implications here about this change in protein. And I know that everybody's cheering this on, but this has implications for nutrition labeling. So that back of pack label that you have is going to change all of that. It has implications for other ingredients and product development. So I don't really know how legitimate this change is besides simply saying we think that the appropriate serving size should be 1.2 to 1.6 grams per day. More to come on that. The other thing that we see that's different is that if you're consuming dairy, include full fat dairy with no added sugars. So the full fat dairy has really switched from the previous iterations. And then you can also see, which is really interesting, when cooking with or adding fats to meals in the incorporate healthy fat section, that we're to prioritize oil with essential fatty acids. So that's like olive oil. These are the omega 3s that they're talking about, and omega 6s to some extension. And we also see other options can include butter or beef tallow. And you can really see the politics right there. And so what we see that's key differences. So first, we've noticed that there's a new website. Second, we also saw that the scientific committee was replaced. So this was the process component that I think we should really pay attention to, is that whole scientific report that the scientific committee that had been working for 2 years got completely scrapped. And instead, the new HHS and USDA secretaries actually instituted an entirely new group of people that did all of this work in less than a year, because this administration has only been in office for exactly a year. And so I am curious, and I know it's a 500-page document, how much was actually used from the original report and how much they recreated, and what the team was that actually changed the wording and the language that had been written by the team of like 30 people that HHS had employed. So that's really important to know because the typical process was also completely superseded. We've got a new inverted pyramid. We are highlighting meat. And if you go to the website, they say that we are ending the war on protein. I don't know. I kind of feel like you see protein in everything these days, and people for the last 5 or 6 years have really been obsessed with protein. So I'm not really sure where that's coming from. Probably a little bit of bias from the dairy and the beef and animal sources types of lobby is coming in there, which it did seem to be that this new scientific committee had a bit of bias from. And then finally, looking at fat and kind of endorsing or at least allowing for more saturated fat, from the full fat dairy to the things like butter or beef tallow. So if you want to see all of these recommendations, what you can see is the 9-page report. You can see the daily servings by calorie level that they've just released. This was actually released a little bit later than the original reports. You can see the new scientific foundation and essentially what they scrapped and what they didn't. And they were really clear that they kind of cherry picked. They said, we chose this, and they gave a whole table of like, yeah, we decided to go with this that the scientific committee said that we wanted to. And then we were like, no, we're going to throw the rest of that out. They also threw out the equity lens, and they were really clear about that too. How that plays out in the future iterations or whether or not it changes the way that people eat their food, I don't really know. I mean, the guidelines are pretty straightforward in the 9 pages now, and it doesn't really talk about different, racial or ethnic or religious, considerations. So tough to say how that's actually going to play out. And then finally, we've got a several hundred page supplementary that apparently leads you to the research that the new group of scientists used. So it's a bit long, but I think it's really important that you know the nuance and the history of the dietary guidelines. Remember, it's always been political. It's always going to be political if we keep this current type of review process. And it might actually even be good that that's the case because we see a bunch of different stakeholder groups getting their say. It also can be really problematic, especially in issues like the current guidelines because there is a plethora of data to show that saturated fat is really problematic for diseases like cardiovascular disease and other health outcomes. But then it brings me back to the healthy eating index and the fact that nobody's ever really followed the guidelines anyways. We're all getting Fs. So if we are recommending more butter or saturated fat, are people actually going to do it? If they do, that might be problematic. Or maybe in the current news cycle, everybody just forgets about it. So if you have more questions, go ahead and put them in the chat below. I'm happy to answer them for you. And hopefully you got a little bit of information about the history of the dietary guidelines and the fact that they haven't really changed that much. My name is Dr. Rachele Pojednic, and I am thrilled to be a nutrition expert that you trust.